Hi, my name is Ross Bush, and I'm the director of Our Climate Change, a grassroots organization dedicated to raising awareness regarding the impacts of climate change on individuals across the world. Here with me today is Jamey Handorf, Director of Residence Life at Eckerd College. Thank you, Jamey.
Nice to meet you.
It's great to have you here.
Yeah.
So I'm just going to ask Jamey a few brief questions regarding his thoughts on climate change. So thank you all for being here today. So Jamey, first and foremost, do you believe that your voice is heard in the modern political system?
Well, I think that my voice as an individual probably gets drowned out to an extent by the sheer masses of all the individuals participating in the democracy. That being said, though, I think that democracy as a whole works by a collection of individuals. So I do believe my individual voice has purpose and has power, but it needs to be sort of combined with all the others. So I'm not trying to say you shouldn't vote because your voice doesn't matter. But yeah, so kind of both, I guess.
Becomes part of the collective?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Okay, that makes sense. So then, is there anything that you see that is unique about your role in society and how that might impact your voice in a political debate?
Well, given my position on campus here, and that I do teach one class, so there is at least 18 to 20 people who are forced into a room for an hour and 20 minutes twice a week, who have to listen to my opinions and my perspective on things. So I like to think at that point, my position and my opinions do have somewhat of an influence on at least some folks. And I do have a lot of conversations with students between the ages of 18 and 22, which is a very ripe age to really engage with new ideas and different perspectives. So do I have a special amount of influence over, say, large political figures who are more active in the debate? No, but I think on average, if you're an average person on the street, I probably have a little bit more of an influence.
You have influence over people, young voters, in essence.
Young voters. So the war cry of my class is, educate yourself and then get out and vote. I preach that every day. That's the last thing we talk about every day. So
that's a great war cry.
We try.
So then moving into climate change as a specific subject, on a 1 to 10 scale, 1 being the least severe, no issue at all, 10 being most extreme, how would you rate climate change as a societal issue?
Well, if you believe the overwhelming amount of scientific evidence, it's an 11. Essentially, it is the most important factor that we as a species are facing, because it totally goes across all races, political beliefs, religions, everything. It affects every human being and every living thing on this planet. So it's definitely an incredibly important issue in our time. Again, if you believe the overwhelming amount of scientific evidence,
of course. Yeah. So then, more specifically, from your perspective, how has it impacted you as an individual? So there's society, but then there's your own personal life. Now, how has climate change impacted your own personal life?
Well, I have a house, obviously, here on the Gulf Coast of Florida, and in Pinellas County, specifically St. Petersburg. A lot of the areas are in flood zones. And the first house my wife and I bought was in what is called an A flood zone. It is the lowest level of an area. It's the most likely to be inundated with water in the event of a hurricane or tropical event.
So A would be the most vulnerable?
It is the most vulnerable, yes. And all of Eckerd College campus is an A flood zone because we're waterfront property and those sorts of things. So about a year ago, the government was making changes to legislation as far as how insurance premiums are assessed and those sorts of things, to where the property that we had was going to cost in the neighborhood of $15,000 to $20,000 to insure for flood insurance, which is a more realistic valuation of what it would cost to insure. Heretofore, the government has subsidized flood insurance rates, so they were typically in the neighborhood, I think I was paying $1,600 a year. So in conversations, my wife and I decided that it was not worth living in the house we were in if we were going to have to pay $20,000 a year in flood insurance. And for security purposes, peace of mind purposes, property value reasons, we decided to move and we bought another house that is in an E flood zone. So it's the highest zone that's not non-evacuation. So it's A, B, C, D, E, and the non-evacuation zone. So we are in a much safer location as far as flooding is concerned. And our flood insurance, we are not required by law to have it in an E flood zone, but it would be significantly less, a couple $100 a year. So in that sense, climate change affected our decision as far as where we're going to buy a house.
That's a huge impact too, especially on a young couple. So you are young, and specifically for future finances, that's incredibly important. That's pivotal. It moved.
Yeah, and it's something that we have, depending on my level of paranoia and worry on any given day, debating about how we want to live in Florida long term, if we want to live in a coastal state long term,
Right.
or do we want to move somewhere further up north in the mountainous type areas that, while not immune from all effects of climate change, would be immune from the most damaging aspects of climate change if you look at the rising sea level factors. If you look at the rising sea level things, a lot of this campus wouldn't even be here.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
the job security aspect also comes into play. If this institution is no longer here and I work here and it's suddenly underwater, I wouldn't have a job.
Right, exactly.
So, yeah.
And the 2014 National Climate Assessment specifically mentioned the Tampa Bay area as one of the most vulnerable regions in the country in regards to climate change, specifically for the reasons which you outlined, our incredibly low-lying coast and sea level rise. So that's very interesting to hear, very interesting to hear. Then President Obama has 2 years left in office, and many people think in 2 years he can't get much done. Well, he's still the president for another 2 years.
Yeah.
What advice would you have regarding climate change for President Obama as he moves forward in his final 2 years as president?
Probably be to never get complacent. Like, don't ever feel like, well, nothing's ever going to move forward, so why try?
Right.
In 25, 30 years, I think our planet is going to look drastically different than it does now, and it's his responsibility as holding the highest elected position in the land, if you will, in our country at least, to be proactive on these issues and to safeguard the future of our country. And a lot of our country is bordered by oceans, and a lot of our country relies on regular weather patterns to feed the country. So climate change is super important, and you would hope that the president, as the commander-in-chief and everything, whose sole purpose is to safeguard the future of America for all generations. I would say, don't give up, don't become jaded, don't get complacent. Fight the good fight for as long as is necessary, which at this point we'll be fighting climate change forever. Essentially, at this point, we're probably past the point of no return. But yeah, be open-minded to different perspectives, and don't get bummed out by the naysayers.
I think that's a great point. But keeping in mind that President Obama does only have 2 years,
He does.
what would you say to the 2016 presidential candidates? What do you want them to know specifically about your beliefs regarding climate change, and what would you have them do? What would you have them run in favor of?
Well, I would say that, again, I'll revert back to if you believe the overwhelming amount of scientific evidence, that it's one of the most pressing factors that we as a species faces. And while I'm sure the majority of the election will focus on more short-sighted issues, the economy, healthcare, middle class, all those sorts of things, as far as long-term issues that need to be addressed now, at this point, and from here on, climate change is something that you have to address. It's something that you have to acknowledge and you have to consider. You can't just keep pushing it off. We're at the precipice in history at which point we can no longer just keep kicking the can down the road because we're approaching a cliff and the can's going to fall off. So we need to make changes, and we need to really factor in what we're going to do as individuals and as a country going forward. And we have to look to our leadership for guidance on that. It's great for me or for you to recycle at our houses or have a garden in our backyard, but short of large-scale political, social, cultural shifts, we're really behind the times on getting where we need to be in regards to climate change.
I think it's a very interesting point, because you're really dealing with a wicked problem in that it doesn't operate by our temporal standards. We look at midterm elections every 2 years, presidential elections every 4, and our problem sense is typically very short-sighted. So I think the idea that this long-term game needs to be presented and it needs to become more of a priority. And with that in mind, last question for you. As a parent, what would you teach your kids about climate change, or what would you advise to other parents to discuss with their kids about climate change? Because moving forward, that's going to become more and more pivotal. What are kids learning in school about climate change, and should they learn more? But that's something that I'm very curious about.
First and foremost, I teach them how to swim.
Okay, all right, makes sense.
But no, in all seriousness, it's in the same way that we teach children now about the most basic aspects of social studies and American history, global history, in the way that we teach them that gravity is a constant, you'll need to teach climate change as a constant to an extent, as you live in an ever-changing world, and it's just so happens you were born at a time and will live through a time in which it's going to change more dramatically than it has in the 100 years prior, as far as climate is concerned. So teaching them to rethink how we do everything. You know, you have to rethink how you approach agriculture, how you approach housing, how you approach transportation. The fossil fuels, which a lot of people point to as a key factor in global warming, you know, we may not have that available in the future. So teaching them to be open-minded, to change the way they think, to change how they approach their future and how they teach their children even. Just because we've always done it this way clearly doesn't mean it's the best way. I mean, I'm not going to advocate that we should forget our past and forget history, but I think lately we are not learning from the past and learning from history. So you really need to educate your children, and I say this both personally in my home with my daughter, but also on a much larger scale in public schooling systems across the country and in the globe for that matter, that you need to be able to adapt. I don't think we teach adaptability nearly as much as we really do. We teach towards the test specifically, and I don't want to digress into a conversation about education.
Climate change is all encompassing.
It is all encompassing, but there's a lot of things that we don't address as far as being able to be flexible in the world and adapt, and that's why I think a lot of younger people these days, not that I'm old again, but younger generations coming up, they don't bounce back quite as well as, say, my grandparents, the greatest generation, if you will.
Type of resiliency.
Yeah, they're not as resilient as we as a society are not as resilient as we once were. And we're going to be faced with something that's going to challenge us to adapt and change very dramatically in very large, real ways. So teaching them how to adapt, I think, is going to be key.
It's that feeling of being uncomfortable with something, and something that large as climate change, that really strikes the core of our society, because we are so comfortable. We are so comfortable, especially in a developed country. We're not faced every day with necessarily food crises that other places are, that are more reliant on an agricultural sector that does not have the technology that we have, this type of insulation. So I think you're right. To teach younger generations how to adapt, how to be resilient, that's very important.
And I think what you're saying, bringing up something that I was just thinking about, is and to not be afraid. Like, climate change is an incredibly scary thing. If you believe the overwhelming amount of scientific evidence, the things that they predict and the changes, it's incredibly scary because it challenges the status quo that we have always known. And that doesn't mean that the future is necessarily going to be this apocalyptic, scary place, but it's going to be very different.
Yeah, it'll be different.
And we don't like to talk about and really discuss things that are different to that extent, be it any topic for that matter. So to address one that's going to change fundamentally the planet as we know it is incredibly scary for a lot of people. And I think that is at the heart of why there's so many people who deny climate change, who don't want to talk about it, don't want to acknowledge it, who don't want to make systematic changes now to adapt for that inevitable future. It's because it's scary. And people, you don't want to talk about scary things.
Right. It's almost a basic psychological reaction. Change is bad. Any change, we're afraid of change. So a change of this magnitude is very frightening, and it could be paralyzing when it should not be.
Yeah. So I would teach children not to fear it, but to learn from it and to strive to survive, and not in a scary way. I shouldn't say strive to survive, more to thrive. Yeah, learn to thrive in the world as it will be then, because it won't be as it is now.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
All right, well, thank you, Jamey.
Yeah.
I appreciate having you here today.
It's a pleasure.
And once again, I'm Ross Bush with Our Climate Change, and have a great day. Thank you.